my name's Lucy Johnstone. I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been a clinical psychologist for many years in the UK. I've mainly worked in adult mental health settings, and right from the start of my career, I've taken a very critical perspective on the idea that people in distress are suffering from medical illnesses of some sort. So I've written and researched and trained a lot in that area. And 5 years ago, I and one of my colleagues, Professor Mary Boyle, were the lead authors of the Power Threat Meaning Framework, which I'm about to explain to you just now. I'm going to start with a little bit of context. As you may well know, because I think you've quoted United Nations reports on your website, there's been quite a high-level call to move away from diagnostic models of distress. So here's a United Nations report from 2017 saying, diagnostic tools continue to expand the parameters of individual diagnosis, often without a solid scientific basis. We've been sold a myth that the best solutions for addressing mental health challenges are medications and other biomedical interventions. That's quite a powerful statement. I think it shows that ideas about what we call mental health are shifting quite profoundly, and that's long overdue in my view. But there's still a long way to go, because people who enter into the psychiatric system are not told this. They are not told that these ideas are changing. They are not told that they're controversial. They are not told that they have very little scientific basis. So the report makes a couple of recommendations, two of which are to think about social determinants, to think about what's going on in people's lives, and to think about power imbalances, about the struggles they're facing, not the idea that people have chemical imbalances in their brains. So this is the general context in which a group of us put together the Power Threat Meaning Framework. The main author group is the top group. We are psychologists and survivors. So Jackie Dillon and Eleanor Longdon are survivors of the psychiatric system. As the project continued, we drew in a number of other people to support and help us. We ended up with about 40 people, about a third of whom had received psychiatric interventions themselves. And it was a 5-year project published in London in January 2018. So what is the Power Threat Meaning Framework? It's a very ambitious attempt to outline an alternative to the diagnostic model of distress. We have widely taken on the idea across whole societies and across the world to a very large extent that if we are emotionally suffering and confused and anxious and desperate, those are very, very real feelings and experiences, of course. It's likely to be because we have an illness of some sort which needs diagnosing, and the main treatment might be drugs, and it might take place in hospital and so on. We are offering a very different way of understanding distress. It's published by the British Psychological Society, which is my professional body, which gives it a degree of credibility, if you like. Very broadly, the framework says instead of diagnoses, we need narratives, and these can be narratives of all kinds. They could be art, music, dance, theatre. They can be written stories. They can be shared stories. They can be social or cultural myths or rituals. Narratives can take a whole range of forms. But the point of narratives from a framework perspective is that they show that our distress is understandable, not necessarily easily or quickly understandable, but in the long run, understandable responses to what's happening in your life, and very often to the unjust and difficult things that have happened in your life. And if we understand that, it helps us to feel more powerful in ourselves. It helps us to think about different ways forward. And narratives can work at a number of different levels. We'll probably talk more about one-to-one narratives today, but actually a narrative can be something that applies to a family, a group, a whole society, a whole culture. And ultimately, the answer to the rising levels of distress we're seeing across, particularly across westernized countries, is we need social action. You know, these difficulties have deep roots, not in our brains and our brain chemistries, but in our societies. And that's where we need to start looking, really. So how do you put together a narrative? As I've said, you can do it in hundreds of different ways. Now, the framework offers a particular way, an optional way. Of course, the whole of the framework is optional, but it offers some suggestions for how to put together a narrative, or how to perhaps build on a narrative you already use. And so it suggests these core questions. The first question is, what happened to you? In framework terms, how is power operating in your life? The second question, how did it affect you? What kind of threats does this pose? What sense did you make of it? Or another way of saying that is, what is the meaning of these experiences to you? What did you have to do to survive? What kinds of threat responses are you using? I've been a long-time member of the mental health system. I like to think that I've been helpful to some people, but overall the system is based on the wrong assumptions. So people are deprived of sound evidence-based ways of making sense of their own experiences. And the framework aims to offer people different ways of making sense of their experiences if they want. So we might want to think of our relationships, our emotions, our links to the community, our economic and material status, our environments, our bodies, and again, importantly, our values and meaning makings. Are we encouraged to come up with our own understandings of our distress? Are we encouraged to live life as we want to, in accordance with our values and our meanings and what works best for us? Okay, what sense do you make of it? This is a very core question in the framework. We all make sense of our experiences, but a lot of psychology and psychotherapy tends to assume that the sense we make of things kind of pops up inside our own head. These are our personal meanings. And we say, actually, there's always a personal aspect to your story, your meanings, but meanings don't come from nowhere. Meanings are made and found. And we're not encouraged to question those meanings. And so those social meanings that are all around us are shaped by ideological meanings. It actually works to some people's benefits. For example, if women end up blaming themselves for being raped or assaulted, as they very often tend to do. I've worked with hundreds of women who have been raped or abused. Each and every one of them thought it was their personal fault. Hardly any of them had ever told anyone else about it. So how did they all come to that same conclusion? It has to be because they pick up the messages from all around them. And that's not an accident. It makes it much easier for societies as a whole to ignore the impact of abuse and sexual violence in women's lives by persuading them to blame themselves. And of course, there are equivalent examples for men. Okay, so the framework wants to go beyond a lot of traditional therapy and trace meanings back to the ideological power behind them. What did you have to do to survive? This is roughly the same as what in psychiatry we call symptoms. We've all evolved to respond to threats. And of course, threats affect our bodies as well as our minds. There's a lot of interesting research on this recently. When we are emotionally threatened or terrified or hurt, our bodies go into a state of alert. It's not just what happens in our feelings and our minds. And some of these threat responses, or survival responses, which we call them in the framework, are kind of pretty hard to control. We have automatic biological responses to fight or flee if we're in danger, or to give up or to become helpless. But some of the responses we use are perhaps to a greater degree under our control. So at the bottom of the list, we may make a bit more choice about, well, I'm going to use eating to soothe myself, or I'm going to use alcohol to get rid of the pain. And some of the things we use. So how do we put together threats and threat responses? This is a main purpose of the framework. We need to show that the threat responses are not symptoms of an illness, but they arise in response to the threats. They are attempts of people to survive very difficult circumstances in the past and in the present. If we think back about diagnostic models again, the DSM and the ICD, the long lists of ways in which people are said to be mentally ill or mentally disordered, they work very badly, I would say, and the evidence shows in the mainly white Western culture in which these manuals were developed, they work even worse when they're exported across the globe. So there is a movement called the Movement for Global Mental Health, which some of you will have heard of, which is about exporting psychiatric thinking across the globe to countries and cultures that didn't know they needed it, and in my view don't need it, heavily supported by drug company money, of course. And it seems to me this is even more damaging than using that way of thinking in the westernized cultures within which these manuals were developed. And here's a very controversial statement, but I think it's very true. Psychiatrists like Suman Fernando, who works in the UK, have argued this is simply another form of colonialism. It's less obvious than the colonialism of the British Empire, but actually it's just as damaging, partly because it's harder to spot. When you get into people's minds, it's harder to see how you're colonizing their whole way of life and imposing a very particular other means of understanding, changing people's realities, very often destroying, or at the very least marginalizing, their own cultural beliefs. Whereas a psychiatrist called David Ingleby has said, Western psychiatry can certainly provide low and middle income countries with instructive examples. They're mainly examples what not to do. So the framework has a very different perspective. The framework, we're not aiming to export the framework. The framework will take a very different perspective, and it would say, well, of course, different societies, different cultures will have different ways of expressing, experiencing and healing distress. There's no universal model. It's not up to us as Westerners to go along to another group of people and say, well, we've got the proper science here. We need to be appropriately humble, and we need to be able to learn from each other, not impose one paradigm on another set of paradigms. I went to New Zealand and was privileged to meet some people of Maori heritage and to meet a Maori psychiatrist who said that the publication of the Power Threat Meaning Framework had been very helpful to her in arguing to set up a clinic which works with Maori understandings of distress, which are very different from diagnostic ones. They're about stories about the Sky Father and the Earth Mother and the gods and their conflicts and their triumphs and the way they relate to each other and the difficulties they overcome and so on. So a Maori approach to distress would be to sit down with someone's extended family and share stories about the gods to see if this would shed light on the particular difficulties that somebody or their family group are experiencing. Now, this Maori psychiatrist isn't explicitly using the framework in her clinic. She doesn't need to. They have these Maori understandings which are very helpful and healing for people of Maori heritage. But she was pleased that it existed because it allowed her to make the argument for setting up these clinics. And she described the PTMF as a distant cousin with more commonalities than differences. Number of peer groups in the UK have taken up the framework as an alternative way of understanding their distress. A peer group being a group of people who have received or who are receiving mental health services, but who've met without any professional. One of the groups was led by a woman called Amanda Griffiths, and she said, what I didn't expect was that the framework would empower me to reclaim my selfhood as I began the life-changing process of transforming from a service user labelled with a pejorative, that is a damaging personality disorder label, to become a strong independent survivor taking control of my own life. So what she did was, and what the other group as well did, was to introduce the framework to the peer group very simply, and they spent a week on each of the core questions, thinking together, what has power, or how has power operated in my life, what threats has this posed to me, and so on. And in doing so, they were able to construct new narratives for themselves. Amanda has generously agreed to share the new narrative that she developed for herself, and I will show it to you now. You can have the slides, as I say, so if you don't have quite time to read it all, you can read it afterwards, or you'll find it on the website. Sorry, so this is Amanda's starting point. She had very traumatic experiences, and her experiences were sadly reinforced in the mental health system. She was coerced, she was abused, she was told she had a personality disorder. She felt she had to be a very good girl in order not to be subjected to further abuses in the psychiatric system. It's a common story, isn't it? Someone comes into services with a very difficult life history, which of course tells us a lot about why they're distressed, and they end up being re-traumatized. So, not surprisingly, this posed a lot of threats to her in lots of areas of her life. She has flashbacks, she has disturbing dreams, she feels she can't tell her story, she's angry, she's anxious, she's physically exhausted and unwell very often. She often feels suicidal, or at least this was true at the time that she wrote it. I'm going to move on because I've got an eye on the time. And it's perhaps not surprising that this is the conclusion she came to. She believed she was worthless, undeserving, there was something wrong with her. It was her fault in some way. She believed that others couldn't be trusted, that the world is an unsafe place, and perhaps she might even be better off dead. And she felt she had to survive any way she could, by avoiding people, by distrusting people, by sometimes being angry to protect herself, by dissociating, by using alcohol to numb the pain. So you can see very clearly that these are not symptoms of an illness, these are threat responses that are being understandably used because of the threats, and the threats have arisen because of the power abuses. It all makes sense. She had to do something to survive, and this is what she's doing. She's also able to see that she has many strengths. She's read a lot about the impact of trauma. She has found some helpful professionals within the mental health system, I'm glad to tell you. And she has a beautiful family who supports her, and she has the peers that she works with. And this is how she put it together. So I think you can see this is the narrative has changed, hasn't it? The narrative started off, I have a personality disorder, I'm a hopeless case, nothing can ever change, I'm dependent on services. The end story, of course, it acknowledges there are ongoing difficulties. These things don't vanish easily or at all. We learn to live with them, but it's a much more hopeful narrative. It's a story of strength and hope and survival. It's not a story of someone with a personality disorder. It's a story of someone surviving very difficult circumstances with enormous strength and determination. Inpatient wards in psychiatric hospitals in London are generally not good places to be. This is a project that started in 2017 when there was a very narrow approach with a focus on medication, on diagnosis, on not looking at people's lives, lots of violent incidents on the ward, lots of policing and seclusion. And I won't go through all of this in detail because I don't want to run out of time, but in essence, what this team has done over a very lot of hard work over a 5-year period is, first of all, they've developed a whole set of workbooks about trauma-informed practice. I don't know if this is a familiar term to all of you, but these workbooks are freely available. I can send you the link if you're interested. So they can be used by professionals, they can be used in a self-help way. There are lots of helpful, simple ways of helping people to get better control of their bodies, their minds, their flashbacks, their nightmares, their whatever else it is that they're experiencing. This is sometimes known as first stage trauma work, the first stage you need to undertake to achieve a place of greater safety before, if you want to, thinking in more depth about some of the more difficult things in your life. So every inpatient on the wards has a chance to discuss and think about which of these techniques and strategies might be useful to them. And perhaps more importantly, or as importantly, the staff meet very regularly to think about what is going on in this particular person's life by thinking about the power, threat, meaning and threat response aspects. So the meeting starts with thinking about the person's background, their feelings, the difficulties they're facing. It then thinks about power, threat, meaning and threat response, so that everybody, the staff, in conjunction, in collaboration with the service user or the patient, can agree about a story that isn't a narrow diagnostic one about the reasons why you're feeling so distressed at the moment. And that will open up new ways forward. So this has now become a standard part of the service. So the staff describe this as very helpful. They feel they understand the story behind the diagnosis, the person behind the diagnosis. They understand better if someone might seem aggressive or scary, that perhaps they themselves are scared or desperate. They realise there's always a story. The people who end up on the ward say that they feel that their stay has been a lot more helpful. They've learned about self-compassion and being kind to themselves and how to calm themselves down. And after 4 years, there are very significant changes on the wards. There's a dramatic reduction in self-harm, dramatic reduction in people being restrained or secluded. Staff are feeling that they are much happier in their jobs. They know what they're doing. They feel they're doing something useful. Service users are saying, my stay in hospital has actually been much more helpful. We all tell stories. Professionals can be helpful in that process. We don't have to turn to professionals. I can see on your website, you've got lots and lots of examples of things that can be healing, peer support and art and theatre and so on. These are not only very likely to be healing, I would say that they're probably more likely to be healing than some of the stuff you will be offered if you enter into psychiatric services. I'm not saying that services have nothing to offer, but I am saying be careful that what you are offered is what is going to be helpful to you. Go well equipped, go armed with information and knowledge and questions. And if it doesn't seem to be helpful, then maybe you need to be looking elsewhere, because not everything that's offered is helpful. So the framework provides evidence for the central role of narratives of all kinds as an alternative to diagnosis. And recovery is a process of reclaiming our experience in order to take back authorship of our own stories. So thank you for inviting me. I hope it's given you something to think about. And I wish you good luck with the rest of the conference and for all the work you do. Thank you.